The last embers of my life on Crystal Lake were still glowing against the midnight sky when Sheriff Miller's flashlight beam found me, standing in wet socks and the soot-stained jeans I'd slept in. The pine-scented air was now a toxic cocktail of melted plastic and despair. He shifted his weight, his voice a low, gravelly consolation. "Judge Thorne," he said, "I'm real sorry. Fire Marshal's prelim says it's arson. Accelerant trail right to the property line." He followed my gaze across the manicured lawn of the neighboring cabin to where a silhouette was framed in a bright, cheerful window. "You know," the sheriff sighed, the name leaving his lips like a bitter taste. "Beverly Clarkson. The HOA president. My neighbor. The woman who'd filed 12 complaints against my unsightly, inherited cabin in the last 6 months." I watched her lift a mug, seemingly toasting the spectacle. A cold, rigid calm settled over me, pushing the grief aside. I looked at the sheriff, my face illuminated by the dying fire of my home. "Thank you, Sheriff. I'll see you in court." He didn't understand. He thought I meant as a victim. I meant as the judge. My first case on the docket tomorrow morning, the one I'd just been assigned by the Chief Justice, was the State versus Beverly Clarkson, for a misdemeanor vandalism charge. She had no idea her fate now sat in the hands of the man whose past she just burned to ashes. Judge Elias Thorne's chambers in the Oakwood County Courthouse smelled of lemon polish and old paper, a scent he usually found comforting. Today it was an affront. It wasn't the smell of charred pine, soaked memories and lost peace. He adjusted his black robe over a shirt he'd bought from a 24-hour big-box store on his drive from the smoldering ruin of his cabin. The fabric was stiff and unfamiliar, just like the numbness encasing him. The cabin wasn't supposed to be a point of contention. It was a sanctuary. A weathered, cedar-shingled gift from his grandfather, a place where a respected circuit court judge could cease being Your Honor, and become just Eli, the guy who fished badly and grilled good steaks. It sat on a generous, wooded lot on Crystal Lake, a patch of delightful, unkempt wilderness amidst an increasingly suburbanized shoreline. The Homeowners Association of Crystal Cove Estates, however, saw it as a festering thumb. Under the militant leadership of Beverly Clarkson, a woman whose smile was as crisp and cold as a new $100 bill, the HOA had morphed from a neighborhood lawn care coalition into a petty tyranny. Beverly lived in the showpiece log home next door, a monument to beige perfection where not a single pine needle was allowed to linger on the immaculate gravel driveway. The complaints began as paper cuts. Notice number 1, unapproved exterior color, the natural, fading cedar. Notice number 2, unauthorized storage, the vintage wooden canoe on sawhorses. Notice number 3, untrimmed vegetation, the blackberry bushes that fed the local birds. Elias, believing in systems and civility, responded politely. He cited the grandfather clause in the property deeds, the original covenants that protected his cabin's rustic character. He attended one HOA meeting. It was there he met the full force of Carindom incarnate. Beverly Clarkson, with a blonde bob so sharp it could slice cheese, presided not as a chairperson but as a queen. She weaponized Robert's rules of order. She spoke of collective aesthetic values and protecting property investments with the fervor of a revolutionary. Elias's cabin, she declared, was bringing down the tone of the entire cove. His reasoned defenses were gavelled down as out of order. The looks from his other neighbors ranged from sympathetic but cowed to openly hostile. He was the rebel, the outsider threatening their perfect equity. The war escalated. A formal fine for the noxious weed of dandelions. A summons for the attractive nuisance of his old tire swing. When he installed a small, discreet dock for his canoe, she had the county inspector out twice, finding no violation but wasting his time. The final straw was the shed. Elias's grandfather's tool shed, leaning slightly with age, was declared a safety hazard and eyesore. Beverly secured a narrow majority on the HOA board to levy a daily fine until it was demolished. Elias's lawyer sent a cease and desist. The atmosphere curdled from chilly to dangerous. The night it happened, Elias had been at the cabin trying to relax, the latest HOA condemnation letter crumpled in his fist. He'd watched from his porch as Beverly hosted a board meeting next door. He saw her point at his cabin, her gestures sharp and aggressive. He went to bed with a headache, falling into a fitful sleep to the sound of their laughter drifting across the property line. He was awakened not by smoke but by the roar. A world on fire. Orange flames clawed at the night, consuming the wall of his bedroom. He barely escaped, stumbling into the cool grass with nothing but his phone. He watched, helpless as 60 years of family history, his grandfather's fishing rods, his mother's quilt, his own childhood summer journals, turned into light and ash. The fire department arrived valiantly but too late. The wooden structure was a tinderbox. And then he saw her. Standing on her perfect porch in a silk robe, Beverly Clarkson watched. Not with horror but with a chilling, satisfied stillness. When their eyes met across the hellscape, she didn't look away. She took a slow, deliberate sip from a china mug and went inside. Sheriff Miller's confirmation was just the final, terrible piece of evidence laid on the bench. Now in his chambers, Elias stared at the case file on his desk. County of Oakwood vs. Beverly Clarkson. Charge, criminal mischief, third-degree misdemeanor. Allegation, that the defendant did willfully spray paint obscenities on the community mailbox bank. A petty, spiteful crime wholly in character. A case that would normally be shuffled to a lower court, but a backlog had pushed it to his docket. The arraignment was this morning. A knock. His clerk, Maya, peeked in. Judge? They're ready in courtroom 3. The Clarkson matter. Her eyes, usually bright and efficient, were wide with a knowing pity. The whole courthouse, it seemed, had heard by now. Thank you, Maya, Elias said, his voice surprisingly steady. He stood, the weight of the robe feeling different today. It wasn't just the mantle of the law, it was armor. And a shroud. He entered the courtroom. The familiar ritual began. All rise for the Honorable Judge Elias Thorne. The bailiff's call echoed. Elias ascended the bench, his gaze sweeping the room. There she was. Beverly Clarkson, dressed in a tasteful cream suit, looking not like a defendant but like a shareholder at an annual meeting. Her lawyer, a slick young man named Sterling, patted her arm confidently. She glanced around the utilitarian room with mild distaste, then up at the bench. Her face, a mask of polished condescension, shattered. The blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her expertly applied makeup stark against her skin. Her eyes, previously bored and arrogant, bulged with a cascade of emotions: shock, dawning horror, and finally raw, undiluted fear. Her mouth opened slightly but no sound came out. She gripped the table, her knuckles white. Elias felt a surge of cold, dark satisfaction. You thought you were just terrorizing a reclusive neighbor, Beverly? You never bothered to learn what he did for a living. You never saw me in my robe. The proceedings were a surreal dance. Sterling, oblivious to the electric current between the bench and his client, entered a plea of not guilty. He launched into a spiel about community tensions and overstated accusations. He requested a trial date. Request noted, Elias said, his tone neutral, judicial, deadly calm. Given the nature of the charges and the defendant's standing in the community, the court sets a personal recognizance bond. However, he continued, and Beverly flinched at the word, the court has concerns about the defendant's respect for property and its proximity to ongoing investigations. Therefore, as a condition of release, the defendant is to surrender her passport and is forbidden from leaving Oakwood County. Furthermore, she is to have no contact, direct or indirect, with any HOA member or property under the purview of the Crystal Cove HOA, including her own residence, pending the resolution of this and any other related matters. Sterling shot to his feet. Your Honor. That's tantamount to ejecting her from her home. The HOA is her residence. The order stands, Counselor, Elias said, a frost in his voice that silenced the room. The court's concern is the prevention of witness intimidation and the preservation of community peace. She may arrange for a third party to collect her belongings. Bailiff, see that the defendant complies with the surrender of her travel documents before she leaves the building. He brought down the gavel. The crack was like a gunshot in the silent room. Beverly looked like she'd been shot. The facade was gone, replaced by the trembling, wide-eyed stare of a trapped animal. The real battle, however, was just beginning. Elias knew his recusal from the vandalism case was now a foregone conclusion. He filed it immediately, citing the obvious conflict of interest. But he was not powerless. He met with the district attorney, a shrewd woman named Angela Reyes who had no love for bullies. He provided a sworn statement detailing the history of harassment. The arson investigation, now turbocharged by the direct link to a sitting judge, became the DA's top priority. The fire marshal's report was conclusive. A trail of gasoline leading from the Clarkson property line to the cabin's foundation. A credit card receipt placed Beverly at a gas station 10 miles away, buying a jerrycan hours before the fire. Elias also filed a devastating civil suit. Not just for the value of the cabin, but for intentional infliction of emotional distress, loss of enjoyment of life and punitive damages. His lawyer, a pit bull named Susan Gray, subpoenaed every HOA record, every email, every text message Beverly had ever sent about that eyesore or Judge Thorne. The story exploded. HOA President torches Judge's heritage cabin, was a headline too juicy for the media to ignore. The national spotlight descended on Crystal Lake. Former HOA members, now freed from their fear by Beverly's fall, came forward with stories of her extortion, her vendettas, her petty cruelties. The perfect facade of Crystal Cove Estates cracked, revealing the rotten timbers beneath. The criminal trial for arson was a masterpiece of courtroom drama. Beverly, her funds draining into her legal defense, looked increasingly haggard. Her defense tried to paint Elias as a vindictive neighbor who'd used his influence to frame her. It collapsed under the weight of evidence. The forensic data, the receipts, the testimony of a terrified lawn care boy she tried to pay to scare Elias months before, and her own damning, venomous emails. Elias took the stand. He didn't shout. He didn't weep. He spoke quietly, precisely about his grandfather. About the sound of rain on the cedar roof. About the smell of old books and lake water. He described the terror of waking to fire, and the chilling sight of his neighbor calmly observing the destruction. The jury didn't just believe him, they felt it. The verdict was guilty on all counts: arson in the first degree, burglary, and reckless endangerment. As the foreperson read the words, Beverly Clarkson, the once untouchable HOA Karen, finally broke. She didn't scream. She let out a low, animal moan and slumped forward, her perfect hair falling over her face. At sentencing, Elias was permitted to give a victim impact statement. He stood before the court, not in his robe but in a simple suit. "She didn't just burn wood and nails," he said, his voice carrying in the pin-drop quiet. "She burned the last letters from my grandfather. She burned the cradle my father slept in, that I'd saved for my future children. She burned the one place where the weight of this robe, the difficult decisions of this bench, could be lifted. She sought to erase a piece of history, a piece of my soul, because it didn't conform to her shallow, petty vision of perfection. The law can value the structure. It can assess the land. But it can never ever repay what she truly took." The judge overseeing the case, a stern-faced veteran, looked at Beverly with undisguised contempt. "Beverly Clarkson, you waged a campaign of terror over a community for the crime of individuality. You then committed an act of catastrophic violence to enforce your vanity. You are a vindictive, dangerous person." He sentenced her to 25 years with a minimum of 15 to be served. The civil suit was settled shortly after. Beverly's assets, the perfect house, the investments, the HOA war chest she partly embezzled, were all liquidated. The settlement paid to rebuild the cabin, but Elias found he didn't want an identical copy. The old ghost was gone. A year later, on the shores of Crystal Lake, a new structure stood. It was modern, airy, built of stone and glass and sustainable timber. It was undeniably handsome, but more importantly, it was his. The HOA had been disbanded, its oppressive covenants voided by a class-action lawsuit. The neighborhood was quieter, gentler. Some of his neighbors even waved. Elias stood on his new dock, the sunset painting the water in hues of orange and purple, colors that no longer reminded him of fire but of renewal. Sheriff Miller walked down to join him, handing him a cold beer. "Heard from the prison," the sheriff said quietly. "She's not adjusting well. Spends all her time writing grievances about the unsightly condition of the facility. Some people never learn." Elias took a slow sip. He felt the peace of the lake seep into him, not as an escape, but as a hard-won companion. The anger was gone, banked to a quiet ember of memory. He had walked through fire and come out the other side, not just as a victim, but as a judge who had seen true injustice and, with the cool application of the law, helped balance the scales. Judge Elias Thorne never wore his robe to the lake again. He didn't need to. The authority it represented had been tested in the fiercest crucible imaginable and had held firm. Beverly Clarkson, in her ruthless pursuit of control, had mistakenly believed her power, forged in petty bylaws and social intimidation, was supreme. She learned, in the most devastating way possible, that it was a cardboard scepter compared to the tempered steel of real justice. The cabin was rebuilt, but Elias was rebuilt too, forever marked by the fire but no longer defined by it. And somewhere in a prison laundry room, a woman with a grievance form and a permanent scowl finally understood the one rule she couldn't litigate, intimidate, or burn away: you don't get to choose your judge. Sometimes they live right next door.